All right, everybody, welcome to this discussion on the first bank of the United States. Probably, I'm not sure yet if this is going to be part one or if I'm going to be able to cover all the notes here in just 1 hour's time. I'm not sure yet. Anyway, after the Bank of North America was terminated, which we talked about in the last video, and after the Constitutional Convention supposedly closed the door on paper money, the United States enjoyed a period of unparalleled economic growth and prosperity while there was no central bank issuing, or at least a precursor to a central bank, issuing a fiat currency. But while the door may have been closed, the window was still wide open. Congress was denied the power to print money, but it was not denied the power to borrow. And so it was realized, yeah, we'll just have, the central bank that will override that, right? Just like, how do we take away people's freedom of speech without it looking like we're taking it away? What they're doing right now, right? They're having social media take away your freedom of speech. The government looks like its hands are clean in the matter, right? You still have freedom of speech technically. And it's not the government taking it away. It is, in fact, big media taking it away for the government, right? They work hand in hand. Anyway, the plan was to establish a bank to give that bank power to create money, to lend most of that money to the government, and then to make sure that the IOUs, the banknotes, were accepted as legal tender by the public, as actual money, which is what we have today, right? Those dollars you have in your pocket, if you in fact have any anymore, are not actual cash. They're debt receipts. So that $10 bill means you owe, the government has made you owe, that $10 plus interest. They're debt receipts. The only reason you can use them as a means of exchange and purchase is because, everyone has fallen and still continues to fall for the illusion that it's actually money. It's not. Anyway, so under this system, Congress would not be circulating actual money, but debt receipts. And the bank would be the gainer. Well, the government would benefit too, right? Because this would mean unlimited spending. The banks would benefit because they'd be reaping tremendous profits. Only the public would lose in this game. Thus, the first bank of the United States was conceived under this pretense. I mean, it wasn't made known to the public, but that was the whole purpose of it from the start, just like the Bank of North America. That was the intent from the start. The proposal was submitted to Congress in 1790 by, again, Mr. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury at the time. Hamilton, don't forget, was a former aide to and personal friend of Robert Morris, founder of the Bank of North America. So in that sense, his role in this matter was not surprising. Hamilton was also, as I stated in the last video, an avid Federalist who favored not only big government, but also big banking. What's surprising, though, is the fact that Hamilton had been a staunch supporter of a sound currency during the Constitutional Convention, but obviously this was just a ploy to fool people, right? So he could be trusted to be handed the keys to the Treasury and wreak his havoc once in that position. Anyway, Hamilton's proposal was strongly opposed by Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, and this was the beginning of a heated political debate that would preoccupy Congress for many decades to come. In fact, it was one of the central issues that led to the creation of our first political parties. The Federalists gathered around the ideas of Hamilton. The Anti-Federalists, later called the Republicans, were attracted to the ideas of Jefferson. My, how things have changed since then. But anyway, Jefferson pointed out that the Constitution did not grant to Congress the power to create a bank or anything similar to it. That means such power was to be reserved to the states or to the people. In a rebuttal to Hamilton's proposal, he stated, "To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition." Furthermore, he said that even if the Constitution had granted such power, it would be an extremely unwise thing, he said, to do, because allowing banks to create money could only lead to national ruin. And he was absolutely right in that matter. Hamilton, on the other hand, argued that debt was a good thing if kept within reason, and that the nation needed more money in circulation to keep up with expanding commerce. You know, they always have their little excuses, right, that sound good on the surface. All he was looking out for was him and his buddies to profiteer by exploiting the masses, right? Who cares if we drive them into poverty? Look what it's going to do for us. It's always been the attitude. Only the bank, Hamilton said, would be able to provide such a function. Furthermore, while it is true that the Constitution did not specifically grant the power to create such a bank, it was nevertheless an implied power because it was needed to accomplish other functions which were granted in the Constitution. So like I said, the Constitution was deliberately written with loopholes in it, right? So they could, you know, play whatever game they wanted to down the line. A big barrier to that, though, was the Bill of Rights, which, don't forget, the Federalists never wanted to include in the Constitution. Anyway, but you know, the ideas proposed by Hamilton and Jefferson and the arguments that ensued got very heated, and it basically polarized the country. In their own words, here is the thrust of their arguments. Jefferson stated, quote, "A private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." Absolutely right. Hamilton's argument was, no society could succeed which did not unite the interest and credit of rich individuals with those of the state. National debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. Look how he's making it out to look like, you know, the noose around our neck was going to actually, you know, be in our interest, and we should embrace it and help to push for it, you know, blah, blah, blah. Totally the opposite of what Jefferson was saying, right? And he was right. After a year of intense debate, Hamilton's views prevailed, unfortunately, and in 1791, Congress granted a 20-year charter to the Bank of the United States, or what became known later as the First Bank of the United States. It was modeled closely after the Bank of England, of course, which means that it was almost an exact replica of the previous Bank of North America, even though the public was lied to and was made to think that this was a completely different entity. In fact, as evidence of continuity with the past, the president of the new bank was Thomas Willing, the same man who had been a partner of Robert Morris and president of the old bank. As before, the new bank was given a monopoly in the issuance of banknotes. Once again, these notes were not forced on the people as legal tender for private debts and contracts, but they were legal tender at face value for all debts to the government in the form of taxes and duties, which made them attractive for use as common money, and that's what they became. And once again, the bank was made the official depository of all federal funds. The charter specified that the bank was required at all times to redeem its notes in gold or silver specie upon demand by the depositor. At least that's the window dressing that the public was fed so that they would accept this as, legal tender. It was an admirable provision, but since the bank was not also required to keep specie in its vaults in the full amount of its note obligations, it was a mathematical impossibility to uphold, and it was obviously known in advance that it would be. It was just rhetoric for public consumption. The government knew what kind of a fraudulent system this whole damn thing was going to be from the start, right? They were all in bed with each other, folks. As with the old Bank of North America, the new bank, First Bank of the United States, was to have 80% of its capital provided by private investors, with the federal government putting up only the remaining 20%. That was a mere bookkeeping sleight of hand, however, because it had been prearranged for the bank to immediately loan back to the federal government exactly that same amount. Imagine that. Reminiscent of the Morris scheme in capitalizing the Bank of North America, this federal investment was essentially a means whereby federal funds could be used to make up the shortfall of the private investors, which means the taxpayers would back the whole thing up. And of course, that's the system we have in place right now, right? Again, it's a game they can't lose. It's a game we can't win. And it was all facilitated by government fiat, then and now. Call it by what name you please, said Jefferson. This was not a loan or an investment, but an outright gift, or theft is even more like it. And he was certainly right. The bank was able to open its doors with less than 9% of the private capital required by its own charter. Just like the Federal Reserve, right? Fractional reserve banking. They lend out, they can and do lend out, 10 times what they have in so-called reserve, if you can call that reserve, when the reserve really just refers to the worthless paper money, right? So, they only need to have 10% of the worthless paper money that they're actually putting into circulation, lending out at our expense plus interest. Holy crap, when you think of it, man, it's frickin' mind-boggling. The total capitalization was specified at $10 million at the time, which means that $8 million was to come from private stockholders. Again, just on paper, that's not what actually played out. As John Kenneth Galbraith Riley observed, quote, numerous thrifty participants confined themselves to a modest down payment, and the bank began operations on around $675,000 in hard cash. So as you can see, this bank, just like the Bank of North America before it, was a fraud from the word go. Should not be surprised, right? Who were these private investors? Their names do not appear in the published literature, but we can be certain that they included the congressmen and senators and their associates who engineered this fraudulent charter. But there's an interesting line in Galbraith's text that hints at another dimension to the composition of this group. On page 72 of Money, Whence It Came, Where It Went, he states matter-of-factly, quote, "Foreigners could own shares but not vote them." It's just how the Federal Reserve works, right? The whopping bulk of the primary stockholders in the Federal Reserve are, in fact, foreigners, right? They're foreign. They're not even Americans, right? That's been the case from the word go. And I don't have to tell you of what persuasion those investors are, do I? Anyway, it turns out that at the time, the Rothschild banking dynasty was the dominant force, both financially and politically, in the excuse me, in the formation of the First Bank of the United States. Conveniently, the history books leave this ever so slightly important fact out, of course. Biographer Derek Wilson said that specifically Nathan Rothschild had made loans to various states of the Union at the time and had been, for a time, the official European banker for the U.S. government and was a pledged supporter of the Bank of the United States, of course. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, stated, quote, "Under the surface, the Rothschilds long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were the power in the old Bank of the United States," meaning the First Bank. The Rothschilds, therefore, were not merely investors, nor just an important power. They were the power behind the Bank of the United States, obviously. From the beginning, the primary purpose of this bank was to create money for the federal government. Money for the private sector was strictly secondary. That was made clear by the fact that the maximum rate of interest that it was allowed to charge was 6%. That made it impractical to make loans to anyone except the federal government and a few large prime rate borrowers. And the government wasted no time in putting its new central bank mechanism to work for itself. Having invested, quote unquote, $2 million at the start, it converted that into $8.2 million borrowed within the next 5 years, which means that $6.2 million was created specifically for its own use. The creation of millions of new fractional reserve dollars, which the government pushed into the economy through spending programs, caused an imbalance between the supply of money and the supply of goods and services, just like how our fraudulent Federal Reserve System operates today, on a much grander scale, of course. Prices appeared to go up as the relative value of the dollar went down. Sound familiar? In that same 5-year period, wholesale prices rose by 72%, which is another way of saying that 42% of everything that people had saved in the form of money was quietly confiscated by the government through the hidden tax called inflation. That short-lived era of prosperity in this country soon came to an end, all because of the creation of the first bank of the United States. God damn it. Which is exactly what it was designed to do, right? The same inflation effect that previously had plagued the colonies under the Bank of North America now returned to plague the new generation. This time, instead of being caused by printing press money, it was fractional reserve money. The cog that linked the two mechanisms together and caused them to function as one was federal debt. It all hinged around federal debt. And remember how Hamilton said, "Oh, it will actually be a blessing to the country for it to, to go into debt." A blessing, huh? A blessing for who? He wasn't lying when he said it. It was federal debt that allowed the political and monetary scientists to violate the intent of the founding fathers, the anti-federalists. And it was this same federal debt that prompted Jefferson to make these remarks. He said, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government to the general principle of the Constitution. I mean an additional article taking from the federal government their power of borrowing." Like so many things in the real world, the Bank of the United States, the first Bank of the United States, was a mixture of evil with some seeming good on the surface, just to disguise the evil, right? Anything evil has to be wrapped in pretty wrapping paper and a nice bow, right? So that it will look attractive. And it certainly wasn't all bad. In colonial times, the state governments printed as much paper money as they pleased, and the loss of purchasing power was, in many cases, total. The bank, on the other hand, was required to maintain some gold in specie as a basis for its pyramid of money. But of course, that wasn't to last, and it certainly didn't last with the Federal Reserve either, right? It's interesting when to notice what was printed on the bills and how that changed over the years. It went from, redeemable at any Federal Reserve Bank in equal value of gold to silver certificate, and then ultimately to "in God we trust," right? Because there's no backing. It has negative value, in fact, our money. Anyway, even though this pyramid was an inverted pyramid with reserves being smaller than the quantity of banknotes, it still represented a boundary to just how far the money supply could be expanded at the time. And that was a good thing for a while anyway. Furthermore, it's apparent that the bank's directors were imbued with a certain amount of enlightened self-interest, in that they actually wanted to keep the creation of new money within some kind of control. Because if it got too out of control too fast, the thing would went belly up. They wanted to be able to maintain this thing for, a lengthy period of time, for the money to keep rolling in. And if it collapsed, well, the money isn't going to keep rolling in, right? And so they needed a system that would keep propping it up, which is where we're at today with the Federal Reserve, right? The dollar collapsed a long time ago, literally. It has no value, right? But all they keep doing is propping it up, propping it up. print more money, come up with new ways of spending, and yet, tax outrageously to hide the inflation and hyperinflation that's being created by pumping the economy with all that money. It's a balancing act, right? A very delicate balancing act. Again, a game they can't lose, a game we can't win. So they knew that they could profit from this central bank mechanism only so long as the economy as a whole was productive to the extent that it could support this system, right? They didn't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So, like their counterparts in today's Federal Reserve System, they spoke the language of restraint, and in a few instances, even acted with restraint as well, so as not to arouse suspicion and to keep the thing propped up. It was during this period that wildcat banks began to flourish. They were given that name not because they were untamed, although that would have been another good reason to do so, but mainly because they were located in areas so remote in the frontier that it was said their only customers were wildcats. They wanted to operate away from scrutiny. Wildcat banks were not noted for meticulous accounting or business practices. Like all banks at that time, they were required to keep a certain portion of their deposits on hand in the form of gold or silver coin. You at least had that restraining factor in operation for a time. To engender public confidence in their faithfulness to that obligation, it was common practice to keep the vault door open so a keg or two of gold coins could be viewed during business hours to maintain the illusion of solvency, right? Not altogether different from the modern practice of financial institutions advertising how many billions in assets that they hold, right? But never mentioning the size of their liabilities. The government fools people by having all these guards posted at Fort Knox, right? So you're supposed to believe that, yes, the guards are there because there's all that gold backing the dollar. The guards are hiding the fact that there is no gold there. There isn't. It's gone, folks. There's no gold backing our dollar anymore. There was a show done several years ago where cameras were allowed to go in and film bars and bars and bars of gold. They opened the vault, to show that there was all this gold in there. How much you want to bet that gold was brought over here temporarily just for the show, and then after the show, it was shipped back? There is no gold, folks. Nothing is backing the dollar except people's blind faith in the dollar. Anyway, the wildcatters were all too eager to flash a few precious metal coins as window dressing to take care of public relations. But in some cases, as state examiners went from bank to bank to check the reserves, the gold would arrive only a few minutes ahead of them, having been rushed from the vault of the bank previously audited. So there you go. They were just shuffling things around, right? The Bank of the United States, the first Bank of the United States, was able to place considerable restraint upon the practices of all banks, both wildcat and urban. It did this simply by refusing to accept the notes of any other bank unless it had a reputation for redeeming those notes in specie on demand, even though the first Bank of the United States itself wasn't even able to do that, right? But it put pressure on the the smaller banks to actually do this, mainly to force them out of business so it didn't have any competition. The public reacted accordingly. If the notes were not good enough for the Bank of the United States, then they were not good enough for them either, not realizing that the one in charge of all of this was the least to be trusted, right? Unfortunately, even though the American public was much more alert and awake back then, they were still subject to propaganda. So they weren't trusting of the banks, right? Today, people don't even question banks anymore, right? For the most part. Back then, they weren't trusting of them, but what they did trust is the lies that were being said about the solvency of the currency. This served as an indirect force of moderation that affected all banks of that time, and that too was a good thing, at least on the surface and for a time. Some historians have said that the bank was a positive force in another way. Galbraith, for example, wrote admiringly, quote, "On occasion, the Bank of the United States, First Bank of the United States, came to the assistance of good state banks that were being besieged by their note holders or other creditors. So, besides enforcing restraint, it served also as the lender of last resort. Thus, in its short span of life, it went far to preserve and develop the basic regulatory functions of a central bank." But again, this is all window dressing, right? It's all illusory. It really wasn't good because the whole foundational principle behind the damn thing was corrupt. It was run by gangsters. So it doesn't matter what, good it seemed to be accomplishing on the surface. What was it doing in the long run? It was putting the nation into unsurmountable debt and giving them, a worthless currency, right? High interest bearing, non-backed currency with only the illusion of being backed. There's no denying the fact that the First Bank of the United States did provide some banking force to the runaway tendencies of many of the nation's private banks, right? But what the private banks were doing was just trying to get in on the action, trying to follow the example of, the First Bank of the United States, right? They knew that, wow, there's lots of money to be made in this little scheme. And so you see how the public was getting fooled, right? The First Bank's policies was to curtail the small banks from doing this when it was the very game they were playing on a much grander scale. Anyway, over time, as you might imagine, the dollar began to significantly devaluate. The First Bank of the United States was the means by which the American people lost 42% of the value of all the money that they earned or possessed during just the first 5 years, in fact, of its function. The first 5 years, 42% of the value of the American dollar had been lost by playing this little game of theirs, right? We mustn't forget either that this confiscation of property was selective. It didn't work against the wealthy classes, which were able to ride the wave of inflation aboard the raft of tangible assets, property and whatnot, right? Which they had owned in great abundance, just like today. The ultra-wealthy Zio bastards that run the banking system, their wealth doesn't depend on the dollar, so that when they pull the rug out tomorrow, they don't lose, right? Because they use the dollar to invest in tangible assets. Their wealth is protected, not everyone else's, though. And this system especially didn't work against those elite few, the political and monetary scientists, who were making huge profits from this enterprise. The bank had done previously what Hamilton had always advocated, which was, quote, to unite the interest and credit of rich individuals with those of the state. Remember, he said that. The development of this plutocracy was well described by Governor Morris, the former delegate from New York, who had helped to draft the Constitution into its final form. He had been an assistant to Robert Morris, not related, and was a champion of the concept of a natural aristocracy. So he knew that his subject well when he gave this warning. He said, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did. They always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere if we do not, by such a government, keep them within their proper spheres. We should remember that the people never act from reason alone. The rich will take advantage of their passions and make these the instruments for opposing them. The result of the contest will be a violent aristocracy or a more violent despotism." Yep, never were truer words spoken. And just look at the system we're enslaved by today. It's the natural outgrowth of what the first Bank of the United States was, or the bank before that, for that matter, the Bank of North America. In spite of all the propaganda designed to fool the public, and certainly some people, at least initially, were fooled, the tide of political pressure against the bank was starting to rise steadily because people were realizing that the dollar was devaluated. Inflation was being created. This bank wasn't the great blessing that they were promised it was going to be. It's tempting for critics of the central bank mechanism to attribute that to the awakening common sense of the American public, but unfortunately, the picture is not that pleasing. It's true that the Jeffersonian Republicans were eloquently holding forth against the bank's progenitor, and their influence was substantial. But there was another group that joined with them, which had almost exactly opposite ideas and goals. The Jeffersonians opposed the bank because they believed that it was unconstitutional, and because they wanted a monetary system based only on gold and silver coin. The other group was made up of the wildcatters, the land speculators, and the empire building industrialists. So they just didn't like that they had, stiffer competition with government backing them, right? But they still were after the same thing. They wanted the ability to issue their own fiat currency and profiteer the way that the big bank was doing, the first Bank of the United States. So that was primarily the reason for the opposition. Sure, there were people in the general public that were disgusted, but largely they were falling for a lot of the propaganda, and they weren't the ones that were most boisterous in voicing their opposition to the bank. It was just smaller competitor banks that wanted to play the same game. Pretty sad. Anyway, a very fierce debate raged in Congress, primarily at the hand of small competitor banks, who gathered en masse together to counteract the influence of the first Bank of the United States. And they made their voice heard so loudly that on January 24th, 1811, the Bank of the United States, the first Bank of the United States, was forced to close its doors. Congress had to acquiesce because of the tremendous pressure. Sadly, it wasn't the right people protesting for the right reasons that caused the charter to end. But nevertheless, it did end, which just meant now that all these smaller banks could monopolize and capitalize on fiat currency instead of the one central bank. So the situation really, under that situation, was destined to fail anyway, right? It wasn't an improvement. It was just ending the centralized bank and its ability to engage in the same practices on a more grander scale, but still collectively these smaller banks would result in the same thing, maybe just take a little longer. Very, very sad. Sad story in our history. One of many sad stories in our history. The battle may have been decided, but the war was far from over, however. The losers, bitter with defeat, merely regrouped their forces and began to prepare for the next encounter. They weren't going to give up. Sure, the first bank had its doors shut, but, we know how relentless the Zio bastards are, right? Unfortunately, the events that followed were ideally suited for their plans, with the moderating effect of the banknotes removed from the scene. The nation's banking system passed wholly into the hands of the state-chartered corporations, many of which were imbued with the wildcat mentality. Their members grew rapidly, and so did the money supply, which they had created. So again, inflation still ruled the day, right? And public dissatisfaction began to rise. The situation didn't improve, even though the first bank charter had come to an end. However, though, if the free market had been allowed to operate, it's likely that the competition soon would have weeded out the wildcatters and restored balance to the system. But that was never given a chance, because soon, very soon, conveniently, the War of 1812 saw to that, right? That this thing would turn around in favor of a second Bank of the United States being established. They didn't want competition to eventually snuff out the wildcatters, right? And they didn't want a monetary system to perpetuate that wasn't under their control, right? So, yeah, along comes the War of 1812. This war was one of the most senseless in our history, right? The primary cause, we are told, was the British impressment into their navy of American sailors on the high seas to assist in the war against Napoleonic France, right? But the French had done exactly the same thing to assist in the war against England, yet their acts were ignored. Furthermore, the British had already rescinded their policy regarding American seamen before the war was underway, which means that the cause of the war had been removed and peace could have been restored in honor if Congress had so wished. So that was just used as the cover, right? It wasn't the real reason, obviously. So we have to conclude then that the pro-banking interests in the United States, pro-central banking interests, wanted the conflict because of the profits that could be realized from it, and to get us back into a stranglehold under a central banking system. Evidence of this is the fact that the New England states, which were home to the seamen who had been impressed, into service, were firmly against the war, while the Western and inland southern states, which were home to the myriad of wildcat banks, howled loudly for a clash of arms. So there you go. It tells you who was really behind this agenda, right? In any event, the war was unpopular with the average citizen, and it was out of the question for Congress to obtain funding for arrangements through an increase in taxes. So the government needed the state banks to create that money outside of the tax structure, and thus came to their rescue to protect them from the discipline of the free market. It was a classic case of the unholy alliance, the cabal, that always develops between political and monetary figures, right? Professor Rothbard gives the details. He stated, quote, "The U.S. government encouraged an enormous expansion in the number of banks and in banknotes and deposits to purchase the growing war debt. These new and recklessly inflationary banks in the Middle Atlantic, Southern, and Western states printed enormous quantities of new notes to purchase government bonds. The federal government then used these notes to purchase arms and manufactured goods in New England." Look at an arrangement they had here. By August of 1814, it became clear that the banks of the nations, apart from New England, could not pay in specie, that they were insolvent. Rather than allow the banks of the nation to fail, the governments, state and federal, decided in August of 1814 to allow the banks to continue in business while refusing to redeem their obligations in specie. In other words, the banks were allowed to refuse to pay their solemn contractual obligations. What a scam. This general suspension was not only highly inflationary at the time, it set a precedent for all financial crises from then on. Whether the U.S. had a central bank or not, the banks were assured that if they inflated together and then got in trouble, government would bail them out. Yeah, with tax dollars, ultimately, right? Maybe not directly, indirectly, like they do now. They borrow from the Federal Reserve and then turn around and flip you the bill from the debt, right? But it still comes from our tax dollars ultimately, but it's indirect so that it doesn't look so bad on paper. What a game they play. The state banks had created enough instant cash for the federal government to raise the debt from $45 million to $127 million, a staggering sum for the fledgling nation at this time, right? Tripling the money supply with no appreciable increase in goods meant that the value of the dollar shrank to about 1/3 its former purchasing power. By 1814, when the depositors began to awake to the scam and then had demanded their gold instead of paper, the banks closed their doors and had to hire extra guards to protect officials and employees from the angry crowds. Look at this, man. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had succeeded in fleecing the American public of approximately 66% of all of the money that they held during that period. And that was on top of the 42% fleecing that they got a few years earlier by the Bank of the United States before it closed its doors, right? Unbelievable. Almost 100% of the value of the dollar had been confiscated away. And the Zios laughed all the way to the bank, as they say. Leaning against the storm of paper money all this time was Thomas Jefferson, by now past President of the United States, trying to bring the nation to its senses. He never ceased speaking out against the evils of dishonest money and debt. Jefferson is kind of an anomaly because he did say a lot of really good things that you have to cheer on. But then there was another side to him, and I'll get into that sometime down the line some more. Nevertheless, though, even if it was just rhetoric, it was pretty damn good rhetoric, and everything he said was true about, this fraudulent banking system. He stated, quote, "Although all the nations of Europe have tried and trodden the very path of force and folly in a fruitless quest of the same object, yet we still expect to find in judging tricks and banking dreams that money can be made out of nothing." In other words, we have these lessons to learn from European banks, right? Rothschild banks, that the system doesn't work, that it's a failure, right? And yet here we are playing the same game and thinking we're going to get positive results, that money can be made out of nothing and in sufficient quantity to meet the expense of heavy war, he said. The toleration of banks of paper discount costs the United States 1/2 of their war taxes, or, in other words, he said, doubles the expenses of every war. That's what it's designed to do. The crisis, then, he said, of the abuses of banking is arrived. The banks have pronounced their own sentence of death. Between $200 and $300 million of their promissory notes are in the hands of the people for solid produce and property sold, and they, the banks, formally declare that they will not pay them. Paper was received on a belief that it was cash or gold, and such scenes are now to take place as will open the eyes of credulity and of insanity itself to the dangers of a paper medium abandoned to the discretion of avarice and of swindlers. Pretty strong words, but again, so very true. It is a wise rule, he said, never to borrow $1 without laying a tax at the same instant for paying the interest annually and the principal within the given term. We shall consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debts and morally bound to pay them ourselves. The earth belongs to the living, not to the dead. We may consider each generation as a distinct nation within a right to bind themselves, but not the succeeding generation. And in other words, the arrangement we have now is going to enslave not only this current generation, but generations to come, right? With the compounding interest and whatnot. The modern theory of the perpetuation of debt, he said, has reached the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating. Right, with the compounding interest. And still, Congress did not listen, of course. Soon Congress would give birth to the second bank of the United States, which will be the topic of our next video. Thanks for joining me, folks. We'll catch you then. Take care.